Hello and welcome to Euronews Now with me, Rosie Wright. Let's get you up to date with the day's top stories. More than 1,800 people have died of the coronavirus in Italy. The World Health Organization says Europe is the epicenter of the pandemic. 100 million Europeans are living in lockdown. Spain joins Italy as the second European country to ask everyone to stay at home. Borders are tightened across the continent. A number of countries, including Germany and Denmark, impose strict rules to limit the movement of people. European Airlines axes flights as passenger numbers fall. EasyJet says the majority of its fleet may be grounded. Singing in solidarity. Residents stuck in at home in Italy create a chorus from their balconies, lifting their lockdown spirits. Welcome to Euronews Now. We know that this is an unusual time. Here at Euronews, our editorial team has, as always, been working to make sure we give you the very best up-to-date information from how governments are responding across the globe. We'll start today by looking at the continent. More than 1,800 people have died in Italy alone from the coronavirus. It's Europe's worst affected country. It's now entering a second week of at least partial lockdown. Spain, France, Denmark and Austria have also announced full or partial closures to combat the virus. In Germany, road borders to neighbouring countries are closed. The UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson will speak later this afternoon, and this evening French President Emmanuel Macron will address the public. Euronews' Neil O'Reilly has the latest.
As their country enters another week of total lockdown, Italians are becoming accustomed to eerily quiet streets. The clinical battle against Europe's worst outbreak is moving up a gear. The first of several new intensive care wards has begun receiving patients. Scores of new beds have been made available to treat the most severe cases. After Italy, Spain is the worst affected country. In Madrid, commuters kept their distance as extreme restrictions took effect. Several countries have declared national emergencies in the hope of avoiding Italy's dire situation. In the Spanish capital, regional trains, the metro and buses saw far fewer passengers. France is also coming to terms with a new way of life after the government announced the closures of schools and universities and restrictions on public gatherings. But President Macron, who voted in municipal elections on Sunday, is expected to announce even tougher measures this evening. As the crisis worsens, more and more European countries are introducing checks on their borders. Germany has partially closed crossings with 5 of its neighbours. It's a step the government had said it would not take, but now sees as necessary and unavoidable. Neil O'Reilly, Euronews.
France is entering its second day of partial lockdown, with schools, restaurants, bars and all non-essential shops forced to close. The government have asked people to avoid travel and gatherings where possible. In Paris, not everyone, though, has been following the advice. Our international correspondent Annalise Borges is in the capital and she joins us there now. Morning, Annalise. Sorry, afternoon, Annalise. President Macron will address the country again this evening. Do we know at this point what he's expected to say?
Hi there, Rosie. Well, pretty much everyone here in France is expecting Emmanuel Macron to announce a full lockdown in the country, which could include deploying army and police to install checkpoints around cities to make sure people limit their movements. Of course, that follows the scenes we saw this weekend with thousands of people packing public parks and gardens, the banks of the River Seine, despite the government's indications that that should not be happening. Of course, France has entered now phase 3 of the country's response to the coronavirus outbreak. That is the highest level of alert in an emergency like the one we are facing, and authorities had been asking people to stay at home. But some people suggested that they were confused with the government's recommendations because at the same time that they were asked to stay at home, they were also asked to go and vote in local elections. Those elections have passed relatively calmly and in an organized fashion. The government has made some extra items available for those poll clerks, including, of course, masks and hand sanitizers. But many people here question whether or not that was a smart decision, especially now that there are talks that the second round of these elections scheduled for next weekend could be postponed. And of course, that would invalidate the entire process. For now, we are expecting that announcement by the French president at 8 p.m. local time. But the director of health here in France, Jérôme Salomon, spoke a few moments ago saying that the situation is, quote, very worrying, that the situation in hospitals is deteriorating very rapidly. And despite all those announcements, despite all those measures that are being increasingly constraining people's lives, I'm going to step aside to give you an idea of what the streets of Paris look like at the moment. As you can see, it looks like a normal day, really. Very few people wearing masks. That shop right there is a supermarket. Many people have been coming and going, buying provisions. Not everyone buying a huge amount of food and toilet paper like in other parts of the world, but a large amount of people saying that they are thinking about the next few days and weeks where France could indeed enter this lockdown.
Annalise Borges, our international correspondent in Paris, thank you. In Spain, the number of new infections has shot up dramatically, with close to 8,000 confirmed cases. And in just 1 week, the death toll has spiked to almost 300. A state of emergency was declared on Saturday, and it requires everyone to be quarantined at home and only to go out to buy food, medicine or to work. Our correspondent Jaime Velázquez joins us now live from Madrid. Morning to you, Jaime. As I just said there, afternoon. Sorry, I'm used to being on Good Morning Europe. Apologies. Jaime, the situation did change a lot in the last week in Spain, particularly with the number of cases. What is the mood like? I can see it's almost empty behind you. Are people following the rules? How are they feeling?
Well, as you can see, this is Puerta del Sol, the central square of Spain, and it looks almost impossible that just a few days or even a week ago we had the same situation like in Paris. People were, just going out, taking some baths in the parks, and now this is the situation as things get really difficult here regarding the infections, the amount of infections. We've seen a lot, not many people on the streets. Most of them were carrying, wearing masks and gloves, and almost, keeping the distance, social distance in public transport and also in supermarkets. Only 40 people were allowed to get into supermarkets, and they had to queue 1.5 meters away from each other to make sure that they don't get in touch. And as you can see, almost nobody on the streets. Police patrolling, trying to make sure that people, those who don't really need to go out, that to make sure that they stay at home. That's the situation at the moment. And we have spoken also with some of the workers that had to go to work today, and they were feeling a bit worried about, the thing that they had to stay the whole weekend indoors, and now they are forced to go out, and they wonder why, if they would get infected during, this their work shift, and they will have to they will bring the infection back home.
Jaime Velázquez, thank you very much, speaking to us from Madrid. France has requisitioned face masks. Germany has banned the export of all medical equipment. Now, after emergency meetings in Brussels, the EU is calling on member states to share test kits and ventilators. Euronews' Ryan Thompson reports.
Medical equipment must be shared among EU countries. That's the message from Ursula von der Leyen as Europe becomes the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic. The EU Commission President says member states must ramp up their production of medical equipment to share and must prioritize protecting health workers who are in the front line of defense.
Today it is Italy that rapidly needs large quantities of medical goods, but in a few weeks other countries will need it too. By producing more, keeping it in the European Union and sharing with each other, we can protect our health workers, patients and contain the spread of the virus.
The European Commission will launch a public procurement system to make sure testing kits and respiratory ventilators are available to member states. Italy is seeing firsthand how quickly its health services have become overwhelmed by the number of patients needing hospitalization. Ryan Thompson, Euronews.
Let's look at the EU's response to the pandemic. We can go to Brussels now to speak to our correspondent Jack Parrick. Hi Jack, what's being said in Brussels this morning, trying to coordinate different member states to how best to deal with this pandemic?
Hi there, Rosie. Yeah, we've just had a press conference from the European Commission spokespeople, and there's been quite a few things that have come out of it. The first piece of information is that the Senior Vice President of the European Commission, Frans Timmermans, has put himself in self-isolation because he came into contact with somebody who has contracted the coronavirus, so we know he's now in 2 weeks quarantine. They've also announced a plan to try and keep the borders open. This is the internal borders of the European Union's internal market. They say they want proportionate border controls and they want priority lanes for freight and transport. They're trying everything they can to try and keep those borders open. And the chief spokesperson said that the reason that they're doing that is because the coronavirus COVID-19 has already been found has already been existing in every single one of the 27 EU member states now, so that they believe that closing the borders simply won't help. They say that anybody who crosses the borders, who is in another EU country, should be given the appropriate health help that they need if they test positive by that country that they're in. That is something that the EU member states might not like too much, but because health care is a national competence within the European Union. Each of the 27 member states has their own healthcare systems, and that's what the EU is trying to do. They're trying to coordinate, and they're trying, as we heard in Ryan's piece there, to impose trade measures to make sure that the European Union is providing the medical equipment and the medical supplies to the internal market, and there will be these restrictions on exporting. Finally, and very interestingly, Rosie, we've heard that that on top of the video conference summit that's going to take place tomorrow, EU Council President Charles Michel announcing that the 27 EU leaders will speak tomorrow by video conference. There'll be another video conference today, and that will be the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. She is going to speak on a video conference with the CureVac company. That's this company in Germany that was approached by United States President Donald Trump. It's been widely reported that he wanted them to make a vaccine that would be for Americans only. Now, we know that we don't know what the President of the European Commission will say to them, but we know that they're trying to support their work in trying to find some kind of vaccine. This company in Germany is apparently looking likely to be one of the first companies that will be able to produce a vaccine for the COVID-19 virus, and obviously that is something globally that will be very significant in getting this under control, Rosie.
Jack Parrick, our correspondent live in Brussels, thank you. Still to come here, European airlines are reducing scheduled flights as passenger numbers fall. More on that after the break. European markets have plunged following new restrictions that curb economic activity across the continent. The pan-European Stoxx 600 dropped 8% on opening this morning. All sectors saw their stocks slide into red, but travel and leisure industries have been hit particularly hard, plummeting by more than 15%. European airlines have made huge reductions in scheduled flights as passenger numbers have fallen in the wake of the coronavirus outbreak. EasyJet says the majority of its fleet may be grounded, while IDA, owner of British Airways and Spanish carrier Iberia, has said it will slash the group's flights by 75% during April and May. Our correspondent Vincent McAviney says it's a tough time for airlines.
We understand EasyJet have said that they're scaling back at least 75% of their services. British Airways as well, obviously from tonight, once the transatlantic routes close, they'll have very few places that they can still fly to. I've actually spoken to someone who works as cabin crew for Virgin Atlantic. He says that most of their routes are grounded at the moment, and he and colleagues are expecting some kind of redundancy soon. So it's going to be a very devastating time for the tourism, the travel industry. We've already heard from Virgin Atlantic, Richard Branson, over the weekend. He's called for a multi-billion-pound bailout for the airline industry, something like what the banks got back in 2008. But really, with no kind of possible definite end in sight, it's unclear how long the airline industry is going to be grounded like this. It could be even longer and more hard than the impact after 9/11.
The falls have occurred despite the Federal Reserve slashing interest rates to nearly zero to try to kickstart the American economy. It's part of a series of coordinated plans to stimulate the wider markets. Paul Ging has the story.
The US has cut interest rates to almost zero and launched a $700 billion stimulus program in a bid to protect the economy from the impact of the coronavirus. It's part of a coordinated action announced on Sunday by several central banks. Surprise news was welcomed by President Trump.
I want to congratulate the Federal Reserve. For starters, they've lowered the Fed rate from what it was, which was 1 to 1.25, and it's been lowered down to 0 to 0.25. It's really great for our country. It's something that we're very happy. I have to say this, I'm very happy.
The president also asked people not to panic buy. Shoppers across the country have been stocking up on goods as the number of infections rises. So far, there have not been the same restrictions imposed as in countries in Europe, but more and more states are closing schools. New York's to join them, announcing that it is closing the nation's largest public school system on Monday, sending over 1.1 million children home in hopes of curbing the spread of the virus. Paul Ging, Euronews.
Still to come here, people in lockdown are finding interesting ways to keep the community spirit alive and also thank those who are looking after the ill. More after the break. Our top story. Europe has entered a new week with a new designation. It's now the epicenter of the pandemic of the Covid-19 coronavirus, according to the World Health Organization. Over 100 million Europeans are on full or partial lockdown. France, Spain and Austria have joined Italy in shutting shops and restaurants. Over 1,800 deaths have been confirmed in Italy due to the virus so far. Benny Gantz, the leader of the Blue and White Party in Israel, has been asked by Israeli President to form a government following the third election within the space of a year. The former army chief has won the support of Arab lawmakers who've previously been accused of siding with terror groups. Current Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu emerged as the largest party in the election on March the 2nd, but could only gather the support of 58 lawmakers.
Now we're spending twice
Bernie
as much
Sanders says he won't give up his fight for the Democratic nomination for US president, despite big defeats in recent primary elections. Sanders made the comments on stage during a debate without an audience with his rival, the former Vice President Joe Biden. Biden himself said his pick for Vice President would be a woman. In New York, nearly 27,000 restaurants are being told to close for customers and begin takeaway-only service to limit COVID-19 transmissions. On the US West Coast, Los Angeles has also followed suit on the restaurant ban, while some casinos in the gambling capital of Las Vegas have announced their closure. Iran has announced that another 129 people have died of the disease. The health ministry in Tehran says there's been more than 850 fatalities, making Iran the third worst affected country. The pandemic has forced more and more countries across Europe to shutter public venues, schools and non-essential services. Authorities are also urging, in some cases, forcing their citizens to stay at home. But even as they're isolated, communities are finding ways to come together. Hermione G has more.
In Rome, they took to their balconies and open windows for a morale-boosting rendition of the Italian national anthem. One doorman in the capital volunteered for a new job, musical conductor for the neighborhood. Quarantined Spaniards were less tuneful but no less heartfelt, standing at their windows to deliver a rousing round of applause to the country's health workers on the front line of the fight against coronavirus. Residents of Athens followed the lead, responding to a call on social media to show support and thanks to medical staff. Italian opera singer Maurizio Marchini performed alone, but his message was one of solidarity.
Thank you for joining us here on Euronews Now. Do stay with Euronews and Euronews.com for all of your top stories. We leave you with a no comment from multiple countries who have tried to stop the virus progression by disinfecting main public transportation.